Welcome to WTEW Bible Studies. This is a two-man crew, so it's myself and my son. So, we might miss a week here or there, and I thank you for all that you steady watchers. I wish you would pray, and I wish you would tell your friends, because what I'm going through right now, this series of videos on Insert 20, this is what I was given specially. So I might not be the greatest Bible teacher for all the rest of the Bible, but God has given me understanding of the book of Revelation. And so I'm showing you now how it breaks down, that there are different stories within the book of Revelation, and they come to an end, and then you got to stop there and insert chapter 20. That's where that story picks up and continues. So we've done the first four videos. We've seen the events of Revelation 19, 14, 16, and 6. They're all the same events. They describe the same period of time. So there's a gathering of God's people in heaven, and there's a gathering of Satan's people on earth. At the time of these gatherings, God's going to pour out the last of his wrath. And it's often described as a winepress. So he's going to squash the blood. He's going to kill these people, either with the rocks coming from the mountains are going to be shaken. There's an earthquake and the mountains are rattling. There's also going to be hail. So between these two, people that come to fight against Jesus, they're going to be squashed from these, and it's going to be like a wine press. So you see the old-fashioned way they stomp the grapes. These people are going to get stomped, and it's going to be a sad thing. The birds are going to feast on their dead bodies. We see someplace in Revelation 16, I think they're going to be stacked as high as a horse's bridle, 5 feet high, maybe 200 miles. It's going to be a great bloodbath, great loss of life. Now's the time to get your relationship with Jesus. You don't want to be fighting Jesus when he comes. The events of all these chapters, that is 19, 14, 16, chapter 6, they're followed chronologically by Revelation chapter 20. That's why we have to insert chapter 20 after all these chapters if we're going to understand how this book of Revelation is put together. So chapter 20, we see the first resurrection. We see how we get judgment for us. So those that belong to Christ, those that have the righteousness, the white linen, we're going to belong to Christ, and we're going to be part of that first resurrection. And we're going to reign on Jesus for 1,000 years. So people say when you die, you go to heaven. Yeah, but you're not up there forever. So the people have been dying since the first century. They might have been there for 2,000 years. We're all going to come back with Jesus, and we're going to reign on earth for 1,000 years with him. So that's in our future, everybody that belongs to Jesus. So everyone agrees that the events of Revelation 20 follow the events of Revelation 19. So that's why we started off there. Some people try and explain away the fact that this is the first resurrection. So you go to chapter 20, it says plainly, this is the first resurrection. So this group of people that say the first resurrection maybe happened 7 years before this. And they explain that away by saying it's a parade. So you got a parade. It's basically got two floats in it. You got one float before the 7-year period, before what they call the period of tribulation, which I see is only 3.5 years. They see it's 7 years. So you got one before the 7 years, one after the 7 years. I just don't see that. The second float would be the resurrection in chapter 20. You have to say the first one's secret. God never says he's coming in secret. So what God says in the book of Revelation 1:7, behold, he comes with the clouds, and every eye will see him. We see throughout the book of Revelation, heaven's open, and you see God coming down. So, I just don't get that. But there are people that swear by it. They say, God told me. So more power to you. But I encourage you, whatever your beliefs, to read the book of Revelation like I'm explaining in these videos. Again, this is video number 5 in the series. If you haven't seen those other ones, I encourage you to look those up. So there are other people that say the first resurrection occurs in Revelation 11 at the time of the last trumpet, the 7th trumpet. And since Revelation consists of 22 chapters, and Revelation 11 11 is half of 22, these are the mid-trib people. So if you read chapter 11, you'll see that in fact that is when Jesus comes. And you follow that with Revelation chapter 20. But that's because there are different chronologies. It's not because it's in the middle of a single chronology. So that's not a mid-trib. After the tribulation, you got a period of God's wrath. And after Jesus has poured out his wrath, that's when the first resurrection happens. So I've shown in the first 4 videos of this series that the book of Revelation does not consist of a single chronology. Very important. 6 distinct chronologies. They all come to an end. When they come to an end, we're going to skip to chapter 20 and read it from there. So each chronology ends with the last portion of God's wrath. So you've got Great Tribulation, followed by God's wrath. And then you have the first resurrection. So we've seen 5 of the first 6. Now this time we're going to go to the 6th one. This one's the hardest to see. That's why I waited till now. The other 5 are easier to see because when we read chapter 19, we can see parts of chapter 19 and all those other chronologies. But this one, there is no overlap between chapter 19 and the end of this story. So I'm going to have to start somewhere else to compare, because that's what we got to do. We got to compare one portion of God's word with another portion to see if it's saying the same thing. So if we start at the 6th seal endpoint, so if you read chapter 6, that's the 6th seal. When that chapter 6 comes to an end, we end with the great day of God's wrath. So God's wrath is done, and we see the first resurrection is what the next thing we're going to read. We're going to jump to chapter 20. And it's overlooked as an endpoint. Most people say the seals, they all just go together, they got to follow chronologically, but they don't. Chapter 7 starts a new chronology, so they overlap. The seals are still in order, but there's an overlap. So the 6th seal, when we look through that, it reveals the presence of both God the Father and Jesus. When we look in chapter 19, we only see a picture of Jesus returning, but in the 6th seal in chapter 6, it says in verse 16, so this group that's gathered together to fight against Jesus, it says, and it said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne. Well, that's a picture of God the Father sitting on the throne. And we know this because it says, and from the wrath of the Lamb. So the Lamb is Jesus. So we've got both God the Father and God the Son. So in order to find this next one, we're going to see the throne of God. We're going to focus on God the Father because he is also coming. And that's another thing that's overlooked in the book of Revelation by most people. They don't see God the Father until the great white throne of judgment. I'm going to show you where God the Father is, and I'm going to show you how he's distinct from God the Son as we go through the book of Revelation. So in Revelation 1:10, we've got God the Father has the voice as of a trumpet. So we see that in other places in the Bible where we talk about the trumpet of God. That's the voice of God the Father, and that's distinct from the voice of Jesus. So in Revelation 1:15, we've got Jesus has the voice, and it sounds like many waters. Jesus' voice is not like a trumpet. So if we're talking about God the Father, that's a trumpet. If we're talking about Jesus, many waters. God the Father is the one seated on the throne in Revelation 4:2. While Jesus, so John gets caught up into heaven in chapter 4, verse 1 of the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, he sees a picture of heaven, and in the second verse, he sees one seated on the throne. That's God the Father. Jesus does not come into this picture, into this whole sequence, until Revelation 5:6, and so that's where he's pictured as a lamb again. So we've got God the Father seated on the throne, and it shows a little bit what he looks like, not too much. And then we have Jesus pictured as the lamb that was slain. And so, again, there's differences. God the Father and Jesus. It's triune God. We've got the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And how does that work? It's one God. Well, we picture a marriage. We got one man, we got one woman. They make one family. So this is like the family of God. Now we see in Revelation 4:5 where God the Father is seated. So from the throne of God, let me just get there and read it. Revelation 4, verse 5. And out of the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices. So whenever you see the throne of God, there's going to be lightnings, thunderings, and voices. Okay, that's a symbolic way to picture the throne of God. And we're going to see Revelation 6:16. And here, it just says the throne of God. It doesn't have any symbolism. It doesn't have the thunders and lightnings and voices. But we do have an earthquake. So we've got all the rocks and stuff falling on people. And so when the throne of God comes to the earth, there's going to be an earthquake. And we're going to see that over and over again in this book of Revelation in the same chapters that we've just gone through to show that they all come to the same ending. When God the Father comes, Jesus is coming in that same time, because right there in chapter 6, verse 16, we got him that sits on the throne and the Lamb. These people that are gathered together to fight Jesus, they all see them. These are not Christians, but they know that God's there. So the surprise is over. Jesus has returned, and they're facing the great day of God's wrath. So we look at the seventh trumpet, 11:19. Again, this is the end of one of the stories. It says, there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake. So this is another picture of God the Father coming to earth with Jesus. So we showed how when Jesus comes, different events come around. Well, the same time is the time of God the Father. So that's there. We've also got the seventh bowl, Revelation 16:18. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake. Another picture, same event. We get more and more confidence that these different places in the book of Revelation are all talking about the same events. During the seventh seal, so this is the final part now. This is where this story ends. In Revelation 8:5, it says, there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything about Jesus. Doesn't say anything about gatherings. Doesn't say anything about God's wrath. But that is a picture of God the Father coming to earth, the throne of God, the one that sits on the throne, and he's shaking things up. That's the time that Jesus comes. So that's the time when this ends. So we've got a story that starts with chapter 7, verse 1, and ends with chapter 8, verse 5. That's where we find the voices and thunderings and lightnings and earthquake. We know that that is a picture of the throne of God coming to earth the same way as it was in chapter 6, same way it is in chapter 11, same way it is in chapter 16, like we just showed. So this is, like I said, this was the hardest one to see, but you got to know the voices, thunders, and lightnings, they proceed from the throne of God. They don't proceed from anywhere else. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 5, tells us exactly that. And we see every time we see those voices and thunders and lightnings in the book of Revelation, there's an earthquake with it. So, I guess I'm assuming that's God the Father coming to earth, because the people see it in chapter 6. They see God, and they want the mountains and rocks to fall on them because they know that God is the one, the Father, sitting on the throne. And so that's the same way it is right here in chapter 8, then verse 5. So again, when we get to 8:5, after that, we start with the trumpets. Well, we don't go there, because now we have learned that when we see the throne of God, that's the end of God's wrath. So we go from 8:5. If we want to go in chronology, we go right back to chapter 20 again. And you're probably getting tired of hearing this by now if you stayed with us watching this series. But what happens in chapter 20? That's the resurrection. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. These people lived throughout the Great Tribulation, or maybe they died during the Great Tribulation, but they did not take the mark of the beast. They're part of the first resurrection. They're going to live on the earth with Jesus for those 1,000 years. Those people that are there before the throne of God and the whole world's shaken, they're not going to be part of that first resurrection. They're facing the judgment on earth, but their eternal judgment is going to wait for at least 1,000 years while Jesus reigns on the earth and we reign with him. So that is all the stories. And I've got one more video that I'm going to try and do, because you say, maybe I got all these other ones, but that ended at the 6th seal. We got the 7th seal kind of hanging out there. I'm going to try and tie that up for you and show you what happens in chapter 7 so you can kind of see how that flows. So that'll be the last video of the series. So that was, we've showed how they all come to an end. There's no more secret there. You know how the book of Revelation now is broken down into 6 separate stories. They come to the same end. They might have different beginnings, but they come to that same end. If you want to understand it, you come to that end and you don't continue with the story. You stop there and insert chapter 20 and finish the Revelation, and you'll get how the book goes. So I hope that works for you. I'm trying every way I can to get that. People just don't understand that because nobody else teaches it, right? This is the only place you're going to hear that. I hope you've enjoyed this series. And again, I've got one more where I'm going to go through the timing of the 6th seal and the 7th seal.